What if the world we live in isn't the only one that could have been? What if, just beneath the surface of accepted history, there exists a shadow, one shaped not by myth, but by invention, vision, and quiet erasure? Imagine this: a laboratory gone dark, its doors sealed not by failure, but by fear. A machine that worked too well, a device that healed too fast, an engine that made fuel obsolete. These aren't scenes from a science fiction novel. They're echoes, traces of discoveries that flickered briefly before being smothered. History is supposed to be a record of progress. Yet time and again, extraordinary breakthroughs have surfaced, only to disappear without a trace. Not because they were impossible, but because they were inconvenient, too disruptive, too free. This is a journey into the forgotten corners of innovation. A cinematic passage through 14 stories, each centered on a single invention that might have changed everything. Some challenged the laws of physics, others defied the economics of power. All were silenced. We begin not with answers, but with questions. Why were these discoveries buried? Who stood to lose if they succeeded? And what does it say about the world we've built, that so many inventions with so much promise were deemed too dangerous for public knowledge? From the quiet fields of Pennsylvania, where vibrations once powered machines, to the sealed laboratories of Austrian implosion engines, to a coral fortress in Florida, where gravity seemed to forget its hold, each chapter reveals a moment in time when the future knocked and was told to wait outside. There are no villains in this tale, only systems. Economics, politics, institutions built on scarcity and control. These forces didn't just dismiss the dreamers. They devoured their work, classified their results, and rewrote their stories. But human curiosity is hard to kill. Through recovered documents, eyewitness accounts, and scattered fragments of surviving machines, we piece together a tapestry of possibility. Not to resurrect conspiracies or assign blame, but to reawaken wonder. To remind ourselves that the boundaries of science are not set in stone, but in policy, profit, and fear. This series is not about proving what was real or fake. It's about listening to what was once possible. It's about the people, often eccentric, often brilliant, who saw farther than their time allowed and paid the price for it. So let us walk that hidden road. Let us begin in the year 1899, on the windswept cliffs of Long Island, where a man named Nikola Tesla dared to light the world without wires, and where, in silence, the future was unplugged. It started with a tower, tall, skeletal, humming with promise. Rising from the coast of Long Island in 1899, Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower was not just another invention. It was a monument to possibility. Nikola Tesla, the enigmatic Serbian-American inventor, had set out to do something audacious: transmit electricity wirelessly through the Earth's atmosphere. No wires, no fuel, just pure energy, drawn from the air itself. In a series of experiments, he lit lamps miles away from his laboratory without a single connection. Motors spun, heaters warmed, and light danced, all without a single drop of oil or lump of coal. To Tesla, this wasn't magic. It was radiant energy. He believed the planet itself could resonate with the right frequency, like a giant tuning fork. His tower, he claimed, could tap into that resonance, allowing power to be broadcast to any receiver, anywhere on Earth. Imagine a world where no one pays for electricity, where cities are illuminated by invisible waves, where remote villages hum with life because energy is no longer a privilege, it's a birthright. That was Tesla's dream, but dreams, especially those that threaten empires, are fragile things. Enter J.P. Morgan, financier and titan of industry. At first, he supported Tesla's work, but when he understood the implications, free energy, unmetered and unmonetized, he withdrew funding. The famous quote lingers like smoke: "If anyone can draw on the power, where do we put the meter?" Within 2 years, the project was dismantled, the tower torn down, Tesla's blueprints and research seized. And just like that, the world turned away from the future it almost had. After Tesla's death in 1943, federal agents swept in. Trunks of documents, over 80, were confiscated and classified. What remained of his work vanished into the shadows of national security. But whispers persisted. In 1957, an engineer named Lester Hendershot claimed to replicate Tesla's radiant energy device. Weeks later, his lab was raided. The pattern was unmistakable. More than a century later, the question still haunts us. Was Tesla silenced, not because he failed, but because he succeeded? Did the dream of universal energy die not by science's verdict, but by commerce's decree? In a world teetering on climate crisis, still tethered to burning ancient sunlight, we can only wonder, what would our lives look like if Tesla's tower had stayed standing? Perhaps it's not too late to ask the question out loud. Who gets to decide how far humanity is allowed to go? In a quiet laboratory in 1930s California, another kind of light was flickering, not from bulbs or sparks, but from the lens of a microscope that could see the invisible. Dr. Royal Raymond Rife had done something astonishing. He built an optical microscope capable of magnifying living viruses, something conventional microscopes couldn't do without killing them. But Rife didn't stop there. As he peered deeper into the microcosm, he saw patterns, frequencies, vibrations. He made a discovery that should have changed medicine forever. Each disease-causing microorganism had its own electromagnetic signature, and, like a glass shattering when struck by the right note, these organisms could be destroyed with precise frequency exposure, leaving healthy tissue unharmed. Rife called it resonance therapy. In 1934, a clinical trial was conducted in conjunction with the University of Southern California. 16 terminal cancer patients were treated with Rife's frequency machines. Within 2 months, 14 had fully recovered. The remaining 2 followed shortly after. It should have been a miracle. Instead, it vanished. Before the findings could be published, the director of the trials died suddenly. Records were lost. The medical establishment, led by powerful figures like Morris Fishbein of the American Medical Association, moved swiftly to discredit Rife. Journals refused to publish his work. Doctors who used his machines were threatened. Laboratories were raided. By 1939, Rife's equipment was destroyed. His reputation was dismantled. And the technology that once promised a painless cure for one of humanity's most feared diseases was erased. It wasn't just about science. It was about economics. By the 1940s, cancer treatment was a booming industry. Chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery, costly, painful, and imperfect, had become deeply entrenched. Rife's elegant frequency approach posed not only a scientific challenge, but a financial one. Over the years, others tried to pick up the trail. Some succeeded, briefly before meeting the same fate. Legal threats, funding cutoffs, or worse. Deaths deemed accidents or heart attacks, but always at pivotal moments. Rife spent his final years embattled, impoverished, and forgotten. Today, frequency therapy lingers on the edges of alternative medicine, often derided and dismissed. But the question remains, what if the cure already existed? What if it was simply buried beneath a mountain of profit margins and closed doors? When healing becomes a commodity, how do we treat knowledge that doesn't require a prescription? A storm was brewing in the skies above Washington, D.C., but it wasn't made of clouds. It was electric. In 1928, a young physicist named Thomas Townsend Brown discovered something peculiar. When he applied high voltage to a capacitor, a simple device used to store electrical energy, it moved. Not from vibration, not from heat, but with a steady thrust. A force that seemed to push against gravity itself. He had stumbled onto something extraordinary, electrogravitics. an entire new frontier where electricity and gravity were no longer separate forces, but intertwined. Over the next 2 decades, Brown refined the effect. By 1952, he was flying disc-shaped craft. No wings, no engines, no combustion, just raw voltage. The devices soared around test tracks under their own power, defying everything Newton ever taught us about lift and propulsion. The military took notice. Projects like Winter Haven and Project Y received quiet funding. Brown was brought into the fold, his work absorbed into the defense world. By 1955, he had built craft that could lift their own power supplies, an impossible feat for traditional aviation. Then, suddenly, silence. In 1956, the entire field of electrogravitics was classified. Patents were seized. Labs were shut down. Public discussion became illegal under national security orders. The official story was simple. It didn't work. But behind closed doors, the truth was more complex. Aviation insiders whispered of advanced propulsion programs. Journalists reported unusual aircraft designs, discs, triangles, shapes that matched Brown's early models. There were sightings, radar anomalies, brief glimpses of technology that seemed years, even decades, ahead of its time. Brown never stopped believing, but he died in 1985, unable to speak publicly about the breakthrough that once lifted metal from the earth without a drop of fuel. The implications of electrogravitics were staggering. Aircraft that never needed to refuel, silent transport, spaceflight without rockets, clean electromagnetic lift that could have revolutionized everything from travel to delivery to disaster relief. But perhaps that was the problem. In the age of fossil fuels and geopolitical control, a technology that made distance irrelevant and energy free was never going to be allowed into the hands of the many. So instead, it was buried. And today, when we look to the skies and ask why we still burn kerosene to fly, the answer may lie not in the stars, but in a locked drawer somewhere in a windowless hangar. What if the future of flight arrived long ago and we simply grounded it? The year was 1872. In a workshop tucked away in Philadelphia, a man named John Worrell of Keeley struck a tuning fork, and the world shifted. Keeley wasn't a physicist by training. He was an inventor, a dreamer. And what he claimed to discover was unlike anything known to science, a motor that ran not on steam or electricity, but on sound. More precisely, on sympathetic vibration. He called it etheric force, a kind of hidden energy that existed within all matter, waiting to be awakened by the right frequencies. Using musical tones, acoustic chambers, and complex mechanical resonators, Keeley's motor reportedly powered massive machinery without fuel. Just pure resonance. Spectators saw the impossible. Heavy iron weights lifted with ease. Industrial equipment spinning with nothing connected. Tuning forks, mere slivers of metal triggering forces strong enough to reshape steel. Investors were enthralled. The Keeley Motor Company was formed, money poured in, and the dream of limitless energy seemed within reach. But then, the questions began. Keeley refused to fully explain how his device worked. He said the principles were too advanced for contemporary science to grasp. He guarded his secrets fiercely, even from those funding him. As pressure mounted, he grew more reclusive. Then, as quickly as it had risen, the enterprise collapsed. Investigators descended on his lab. They claimed to find hidden compressed air tanks, an accusation of fraud. Skeptics declared the entire affair a hoax. Keeley died in 1898, his machine seized, his name tarnished. But some weren't convinced by the debunking. The timing was suspicious. The skeptics were financially tied to the very industries that stood to lose everything if Keeley's technology were real. Modern researchers revisiting his work have found glimmers of something deeper. The principles of acoustic resonance and vibrational energy he described now echo in the language of quantum mechanics. Concepts like zero-point energy, once considered fringe, are now studied in serious laboratories. Could it be that Keely was simply ahead of his time, so far ahead that his truth sounded like fantasy? If he was right, the implications are haunting. We could have had clean, decentralized energy over a century ago. No coal furnaces, no oil rigs, just vibration, music really, powering the world. But the rhythm was interrupted, the song was cut short, and what remains is a single note echoing across time, asking, what if we've mistaken genius for deception, simply because it sang in a key we didn't yet understand? A flicker of blue light, a quiet hum, and then levitation. In 1979, in a cluttered apartment in Vancouver, Canadian inventor John Hutchison stumbled upon something that defied explanation. He wasn't looking for it. He was simply experimenting with Tesla coils, radio frequency generators, and Van de Graaff machines, all buzzing and crackling in chaotic harmony. Then objects began to move, not roll, not vibrate, but rise, float, twist in midair. Metal bars softened and bent like rubber. Wood fused into metal. Materials changed form without heat, without tools, sometimes without warning. Hutchison had discovered what would come to be called the Hutchison effect, a phenomenon where electromagnetic fields intersected in such a way that the ordinary laws of physics seemed to unravel. Gravity reversed, matter shifted. The boundaries between states of being dissolved. And people noticed. Military officials visited his lab. Scientists observed the effects firsthand. Videos were made, documenting levitating objects and bizarre material transformations. No smoke, no mirrors, just something new. But then, as with so many others in this tale, the hammer fell. In 1990, Hutchison's lab was raided. His equipment was confiscated. The research was classified under national security regulations. He was forbidden from public demonstrations, his discoveries deemed too volatile, too unexplained. The official stance? It was all a misunderstanding, a fringe experiment gone awry. But those who saw it couldn't forget. And internal sources whispered that the phenomenon hadn't disappeared, it had simply gone underground. In classified facilities, attempts to replicate the Hutchison effect reportedly succeeded. Not just levitation, but matter fusion, field-based manipulation of the physical world, technologies that could alter the future of materials. Science, manufacturing, even warfare. But the implications were too vast, too destabilizing. Imagine a world where raw materials could be reshaped at will, where gravity could be controlled like light, where barriers between the solid and the fluid, the fixed and the free, were erased. It would be the end of scarcity, the end of traditional production, the end of control. And so, it was shelved. Hutchison, undeterred, continued to experiment in secret. But the eyes watching him never blinked. In the end, the Hutchison effect reminds us that some discoveries don't need time. They need trust. Trust that the world will embrace what it doesn't yet understand. Until then, gravity remains firm, and the world stays grounded by choice, not necessity. Florida, 1923. Beneath the sweltering sun and a canopy of stars, a quiet man worked alone, moving mountains without machines. Edward Leedskalnin was a Latvian immigrant of slight frame and soft voice. By all appearances, he was unremarkable, until he began to build Coral Castle. 30-ton stones lifted, carved, and set with mathematical precision. Walls, gates, monoliths, all crafted from coral rock denser than granite. Leeds Kalnin did it all himself. No crews, no cranes, just hand tools, pulleys, and something else, something unseen. Locals whispered that he had found the secret of the pyramids. Children claimed to see the blocks float into place. Leeds Kalnin simply smiled and said, "I understand the laws of weight and leverage." But inside his workshop were clues, magnetic coils, homemade generators, and devices no one could identify. He spoke of magnetic currents, of energy that moved not in wires, but through the fabric of space itself. His notes hinted at anti-gravity, natural resonance, and ancient knowledge lost to modern minds. Visitors marveled, scientists speculated, engineers were baffled. Then, in 1951, Leeds Kalnin died, and what followed was swift and silent. Authorities sealed his workshop. His equipment vanished, not just taken, but erased. Whatever method he used to lift and position those stones disappeared with him. Coral Castle still stands, an open-air enigma just south of Miami. Engineers today still struggle to explain how one man could have moved and aligned such colossal blocks with primitive tools. The balance is perfect. Some stones pivot with the push of a finger, despite weighing more than a locomotive. If Leeds Kalnin truly discovered a method of magnetic levitation, its potential was boundless. It could have transformed construction, eliminated industrial machinery, and rewritten our understanding of physics. But perhaps that was the danger. Like so many others in this story, Leeds Kalnin's work wasn't debunked. It was sealed away, filed under the category of too disruptive. We build with machines because we are taught that there is no other way. But what if gravity, that most constant of forces, isn't immutable? What if it too can be bent, not through brute strength, but through quiet understanding? The castle still waits, stone upon stone, balanced in silence. And it asks, what other secrets have been hidden in plain sight, too heavy to lift only because we stopped believing we could? In a modest British workshop during the 1960s, coils spun in perfect symmetry, circles within circles, until the air itself seemed to hum. This was the work of John Searle, an engineer with little formal education, but an intuitive grasp of forces that defied explanation. He called it the Searle Effect Generator, or SEG, or SEG. The design was deceptively simple, magnetic rollers orbiting concentric rings. But the effect? Anything but ordinary. When activated, the device did two things. It generated electricity, free, continuous, without fuel, and it lifted. Not just off the table, but off the ground. Searle's early prototypes hovered, floated, and even flew. No combustion, no sound. Just smooth, silent motion, born from magnetic harmony. Witnesses swore to it. Entire buildings powered with no wires, machines levitating, spinning weightlessly. It was energy and propulsion in one, a blueprint for a future untethered from gravity or grid. Then, as always, the silence came. In 1968, Searle's lab was raided. Officials cited interference with aircraft communications. Equipment was confiscated. Research destroyed. And Searle himself was imprisoned, not for fraud, but for violating obscure electrical codes. The punishment did not match the threat. Unless, of course, the true threat wasn't legal, it was existential. If Searle's SEG had been allowed to develop, it would have overturned industries wholesale. Power plants, gas stations, aerospace giants, all rendered obsolete by a device the size of a dinner plate. Unlimited, clean energy that asked nothing but understanding in return. But understanding, when paired with independence, can be dangerous. To this day, attempts to replicate the SEG face quiet resistance. Patents denied, researchers discredited, labs mysteriously shut down. Some believe the technology lives on, in the shadows of classified aerospace programs, in the propulsion of craft that don't officially exist. Searle never stopped. He continued building, theorizing, dreaming. But the world he imagined, a world lifted by magnetism and powered by the ether, remains just out of reach. In the hum of the SEG, in the dance of its spinning magnets, lies a question that challenges the very architecture of modern life. What if gravity is optional? What if energy is free? And if that's true, who decides whether we get to know? In the Alpine valleys of Austria during the 1940s, an inventor named Victor Schauberger was studying water, not with machines, but with reverence. He watched how mountain streams curved and twisted, how trout could hover motionless in rushing currents, how nature moved not in lines, but spirals. From these observations, he conceived a radical idea, that true power came not from explosion, but from implosion. While conventional engines force energy outward, Schauberger's vortex machines pulled energy inward. His implosion engines spun fluids into spiraling patterns that generated lift, cooling, and motion with minimal input. They produced no pollution, no noise, just graceful, swirling energy. He called it implosion technology, and it did more than move machines. His devices purified air and water as they worked. They harnessed the subtle dynamics of nature, replicating the same spirals found in galaxies, whirlpools, and DNA. Schauberger's crowning achievement, the repulsine, reportedly generated lift without combustion. German military officials took note, commissioning research into its potential for silent aircraft. Prototypes flew, disc-shaped craft that defied gravity and logic alike. Then came the end of the war. Allied forces seized Schauberger's materials. He was detained, interrogated, and ultimately silenced. Later, he was invited to the United States under the promise of developing his inventions for peaceful use. But upon arrival, he was forced to sign away his patents. His devices were confiscated. His work vanished behind corporate and military walls. He returned to Austria broken and died shortly after, his life's work buried in bureaucracy and secrecy. Schauberger's implosion engines defied the thermodynamics of their time. They offered clean, abundant energy drawn not from fire, but from form. They mirrored the logic of nature instead of conquering it. In a world choking on exhaust and extractive industry, Schauberger's vision remains a haunting glimpse of what could have been, rivers of power that ran clear, engines that breathed rather than burned, and technology that healed the earth instead of scarring it. But the industrial world chose combustion, and somewhere the stream keeps spiraling, whispering secrets to anyone still willing to listen. What if the future wasn't mechanical, but organic? What if our machines could learn from trees, from rivers, from air? And what did we lose when we turned away from the wisdom of the water? It was a summer day in 1943 when the USS Eldridge disappeared. At the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, a secret experiment was underway, one that aimed to render a warship invisible to enemy radar. The theory stemmed from Einstein's unfinished work on the unified field. If electromagnetism and gravity could be linked, perhaps space-time itself could be bent. The equipment was massive. Coils, generators, and electromagnetic field systems were mounted aboard the ship. Then, on October 28th, the switch was thrown. In a flash of blue-green light, the Eldridge vanished, not just from sight, but from space. Minutes later, it reappeared in Norfolk, Virginia, over 200 miles away, before vanishing again and returning to Philadelphia. To outside observers, it was teleportation. To those on board, it was something far stranger. Crew members were changed. Some were missing. Others were fused into the ship's hull, bones embedded in steel. Time for them had twisted. Some reported hallucinations, lost hours, and the feeling of being trapped between realities. The project was immediately classified. The Navy denied it ever happened. The surviving crew were reassigned, silenced, or institutionalized. But the echoes never stopped. Years later, researcher Morris Jessup received anonymous letters detailing the experiment, letters containing diagrams and descriptions that matched the rumored technology. Jessup tried to investigate. He died under suspicious circumstances. Whispers of the Philadelphia experiment persist, not just as myth, but as evidence of a breakthrough too dangerous to embrace. If matter could be dematerialized and rematerialized, teleported, then borders meant nothing. Transportation, warfare, logistics, all would be rewritten. And perhaps most unnerving of all, reality itself would no longer be stable. Independent researchers believe the experiment may have stumbled into dimensional manipulation, tearing a hole in the fabric of space-time and briefly exposing us to whatever lies beyond. Whether the accounts are literal or symbolic, the core question remains: what happens when we tamper with the structure of existence? When science moves not inch by inch, but in leaps we cannot control? In the silence that followed, the Eldridge sailed on, but her shadow stayed behind, a ghost ship not lost at sea, but lost in secrecy. What if our reality is thinner than we think? And what if, in trying to control it, we opened a door we were never meant to find? In a dusty corner of scientific history lies a device that pulsed with invisible energy, neither electric nor magnetic, but something more primal. They called it the Orgone accumulator. In the 1940s, Dr. Wilhelm Reich, a psychoanalyst turned researcher, claimed to have discovered a life force, an omnipresent energy he named Orgone. It was, he believed, the subtle current of vitality that coursed through all living things, the unseen thread linking health, weather, and the cosmos. Reich's accumulators were simple structures, boxes lined with alternating layers of organic and metallic materials. Patients would sit inside them, soaking in the ambient Orgone energy. The results were unexpected. Tumors shrank, fatigue lifted, depression eased. The boxes seemed to radiate warmth without heat, energy without input. He built larger versions, cloudbusters, devices that manipulated atmospheric Orgone flows. With them, he could summon rain or clear skies. Farmers watched in awe as parched fields bloomed days after Reich's machines touched the sky. But the storm was coming. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration investigated. They declared Orgone energy non-existent, labeling Reich a fraud. In 1954, a federal court ordered all Orgone devices destroyed. 2 years later, agents burned his books, notes, and research by court order in public incinerators. It was one of the few instances in American history where scientific literature was literally burned. Reich was imprisoned for contempt of court. 8 months later, he died behind bars. But something lingered. Independent researchers replicated his devices. Plants grew faster, skin healed quicker. Thermometers recorded unexplained heat. Animals, when given the choice, chose to sleep near accumulators. What if Orgone was real? Not as magic, but as a subtle field science has yet to name. A bioenergetic layer hidden between electromagnetism and gravity, an echo of ancient concepts like chi, prana, or ether. If Reich's discoveries were valid, the implications were vast. Diseases treated without drugs, weather guided without pollution, energy drawn not from machines, but from nature's own reservoir. But as always, there was a cost. Orgone didn't fit the medical model. It couldn't be bottled, patented, or metered. It threatened an entire system built not on wellness, but on treatment, on dependence. And so it was erased. Reich's accumulators now gather dust in basements and museums, dismissed by textbooks, remembered by few. But his question still pulses. What if the universe breathes, and we once knew how to breathe with it? Stone by stone, a secret was carved into the earth. Between 1923 and 1951, Edward Leeds Calnan, built Coral Castle in Homestead, Florida, a monument of limestone blocks, some weighing over 30 tons. He worked alone, under cover of night, using only rudimentary tools. And no one could explain how. Tourists marveled, engineers were confounded. How could a single man move and place such immense stones with perfect balance and precision? The answer, Leeds Kalnin hinted, lay in magnetism. He spoke of a magnetic current, of forces science ignored. In his workshop he kept strange tools, homemade electromagnetic devices, coils, and instruments no textbook could identify. He claimed to have rediscovered ancient knowledge, perhaps the same techniques that built the pyramids. Witnesses reported seeing blocks suspended in the air, moving without force. A 9-ton gate balanced so precisely it could be pushed open with a finger, yet no crane or crew was ever seen. Leeds Kalnin offered no full explanation. "I know the secrets," he said, "of the people who built the pyramids." After his death, government officials quickly secured the site. His equipment disappeared. His notes vanished. Whatever method he used was lost or taken. Today, Coral Castle still stands, untouched by time or weather. Its stones are silent, but their placement speaks of knowledge beyond conventional engineering. Was Leeds Kalnin employing magnetic levitation? Did he tap into gravitational manipulation or natural resonance? Or was it a technology of simplicity, one so intuitive it escaped modern complexity? Attempts to replicate his work have failed. Machinery that could move such blocks today requires teams and cranes. Yet he did it alone, in the shadows, guided by a mystery no one else could see. If his techniques were rediscovered, they could transform construction. Buildings raised with no diesel, bridges assembled in silence. A world reshaped without tearing at the earth. But instead, we've built a mythology around him. We call it a mystery, so we don't have to call it a possibility. Leeds Kalnin left no heirs, only a monument, one that reminds us the past may hold tools we've forgotten or buried. Perhaps the greatest weight is not the stone, but the silence. What if the answers we seek lie not in the future, but in a deeper understanding of the forgotten past? Beneath layers of soot and silence lies an engine that didn't roar, but whispered. In the shadows of wartime Austria, Victor Schauberger wasn't the only one challenging the combustion model. Another mind, sharper, quieter, was developing something that should have changed everything. He called it the implosion engine. Unlike traditional engines, which explode fuel outward to generate force, the implosion engine worked in reverse. It drew energy inward, creating whirlpools of air and water, vortexes that spun with cooling power. The more it ran, the more efficient it became. No exhaust, no noise, only motion born from inward flow. The engine, later named the repulsine, produced thrust without combustion. Some reports claimed it lifted off the ground. Others said it created purified water and air as a byproduct. The design mimicked nature's patterns, spirals, convergence, rhythm. The German military took notice, hoping to develop silent aircraft. Prototypes were built, strange, saucer-like vehicles that reportedly hovered, darted, and defied gravity. Then came war's end. Allied forces seized Schauberger's work. And another story began. Schauberger was brought to America under contract. There, his designs were taken, his patents signed away. He was forbidden from continuing his research. After returning to Austria, he died shortly after, defeated, depleted, and disillusioned. But his principles, implosion, natural vortex motion, energy from form rather than fire, echo still. Today, combustion remains king. Our engines scream and burn. Our machines choke and pollute. We call it progress, but it's a war against the planet we inhabit. What if we listened instead? Schauberger believed our technology should imitate the earth, not defy it. That true power lay in harmony, not in conquest. His engines weren't just mechanical, they were philosophical. He wasn't just inventing machines, he was restoring balance. But balance, it seems, has no place in a world driven by extraction and speed. The implosion engine wasn't suppressed because it failed. It was buried because it worked, too cleanly, too quietly. And so we keep exploding our way forward, forgetting that there was once another path, a spiral, inward, patient, and wise. What if the true future of energy isn't about force, but form? And what might happen if we let the world teach us how to move again? The story ends where all stories circle back to the idea that truth, once found, cannot be destroyed, only delayed. Across these 14 chapters, we've wandered through shadowed hallways of forgotten labs, past sealed vaults and erased blueprints. We've heard the echo of machines that once ran without fuel, of cures that needed no prescription, of stones that floated, of ships that vanished and returned. Each invention told a different story, but beneath them all flowed a common thread, not of failure, but of silencing. Tesla's free energy, Rife's healing frequencies, Brown's gravity-defying craft, Keely's vibrational motor, Searle's levitating generator, Schauberger's spiraling implosion engine, Reich's life force accumulators, the Philadelphia experiment's broken veil of reality. These weren't isolated tales. They were part of a pattern, a quiet, persistent suppression of anything that challenged the status quo. Not because they were unscientific, but because they were unprofitable, uncontainable, uncontrollable. In a world shaped by scarcity, technologies that promise abundance are dangerous, not to people, but to systems, to industries built on consumption, to institutions that rely on limits to maintain power. And so these inventions were buried, their creators ridiculed, erased, or broken. But memory is resilient. Fragments survive in forgotten patents, whispered testimonies, grainy footage, and the occasional spark of rediscovery. Researchers still attempt to rebuild what was lost. Some succeed, quietly. Others disappear. The question now is not just what was hidden, but why. What world could we live in today if even one of these discoveries had been allowed to flourish? If we had chosen healing over profit, resonance over combustion, curiosity over fear? What might our cities look like? Our skies? Our bodies? Our minds? We live still within a narrow version of what is possible, told that certain frontiers are unreachable, certain ideas impractical, certain hopes naive. But history whispers otherwise. And so this story closes not with certainty, but with an invitation. To look again, to question the silence, to seek the forgotten, to wonder not just what is, but what could have been, because the future is not only what we build, it is what we are allowed to remember. And sometimes remembering is the most radical act of all.